The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
We're going to our final session today, and Dr. Kevin Stace is going to be with us now. He is the ELL coordinator of Clarksville, Montgomery County Schools. Hello, Dr. Stacy. Dr. Stacy comes to us with multiple perspectives as an ESL teacher and district administrator in more than one district. So he's got perspectives from the urban experience, from the suburban experience, and he really brings a broad perspective. His session today is the why and how of engaging literacy practices. Engaging literacy practices. You know, we heard from two elementary school teachers this morning. Well, Dr. Stacy's focus this time is literacy strategies for older students in middle or high school. So, Dr. Stacy, we frequently have requests from members of the ELL Collaborative for help in working with older students. And so I know we have high level of interest in what you have to say today. So please go ahead.
Well, excited to be with you today, and also thank you, Dr. Clark, for having me. My years as an EL teacher was in the high school setting before I moved into administration, and I started with EL in the early 90s. And the why, how, if you'll look at the screen, you'll see that that's an exponent of the how. But the why is the foundation. And the why in my own life, as I've approached EL and as a teacher and as an administrator, has changed and developed over the years and how I've done things. But I've also come to know we don't understand the context, understanding where we are in the process of then the implementation is going to suffer if people don't know why, the urgency, the importance of why these literacy practices, and how do we get learning, language, and literacy pulled together in a process that makes sense to high school teachers. Now, I have been in a lot of district meetings, and when you get in front of elementary principals, you're going to have a lot of questions. When you get in front of middle school principals, hello, are you here? And when you get in front of high school principals, impress me. And so I was asked recently to do a high school POC for all of the high school principals by the high school director. And at first I thought, wow, what a great opportunity. And then I went back to my office and thought, oh, what an opportunity, scared to death because of my audience. And so as I began to think about this, how am I going to bring my passion to these principals to help understand the need? And so that's what I want to focus on today. How do we help others, other high school teachers, other leaders understand the need to utilize EL teachers in their building? Because you've got great strategies. And how do we bring the urgency for our students, but not just only our students? We're going to find out that one of the things that's very catching is that, did you know that most high schools only have a 5th grade reading? And did you know that from 2015 to 2019, we dropped to 2 percentile points on our NAEP reading scores, and they were horrible to begin with. And so when we're looking at this, this really talks about a lot of students in our buildings. But what I began to understand is a lot of leadership really did not understand some of the intricacies involved with reading and the high school. Because face it, in secondary, we don't become reading teachers. We're English teachers. We're literacy teachers. We are lit teachers is what I meant to say. We're wanting to look at Shakespeare. And so when we're thinking about teaching kids to read, that's more of an elementary perspective, but no more. There's a lot of high school students today that cannot read. And so that's how I kind of cast the web to the principals, is that, yes, we're looking at EL, but EL can help you as well in relationship to understanding other students in your building. And then the eyes began to go from down to up, because now we've got a broader focus, and maybe EL can help us with strategies in our classroom. So let's begin. As we look at this, the four big ideas in the WIDA framework are equity and opportunity and access. And that's what literacy is about. How do we provide, equity is making sure that children or students can read and can function at a level to go on to the next level. Integration of content and language. How do math teachers actually work with reading strategies? How do we as social studies or history teachers or lit teachers integrate that content and language? And then how do we work together to do this in a functional approach? So the essential question is how do we meet students' literacy needs? Now remember, I am bringing out a big web here or a net in order to help understand that this is a huge need, yes, for EL students, but also for a lot of students in your building. And then here's the second question. Well, if this is a need, then how are teachers getting their professional needs met? And how do we effectively plan with literacy in mind? Now, when we think about these essential questions for discussion, what leadership practices brings literacy as a focus? Now, remember, I was talking to high school principals. Now, think about in your buildings. What leadership practices are bringing literacy as a focus in your building? And then how are student needs being amplified or understood? And then how are teachers understanding those needs to meet those students' needs in the classroom? So, for example, a teacher who is a history teacher has a textbook, and that textbook is at a 9th grade, possibly reading level, but many of their students are at a 5th grade reading level. What type of frustration is our students having when they go home to do homework assignments, and then they come back possibly with no homework assignments? And then why? Maybe it was because of frustration. So, and then how do we effectively plan with this in mind? And so one of the things that I thought was really interesting with those principals of all the district for Clarksville Montgomery, they said these were the needs to know. They really wanted to know effective strategies. And they really wanted to know EL standards and planning. How do we look at EL as a resource for other teachers? And how do we look at that? And that came from the principals. How do content leaders, and what do content leaders and the experts say? What are accommodations that we need to use, and what does implementation look like? And strategies for beginners. We know we have students in our classrooms, especially EL, and then they begin to think about EL and students who couldn't read, and then how do we help teachers see how it fits together? So this was the needs to know from principals, and I thought that was very telling. So in the very beginning, as I helped the leadership understand is first, who are we? Because who we are emphasizes where we are. So I've got a thinking map here, and then who are we? And these are divided into 3 questions. How do we do business? Well, think about what's talked about in your faculty meetings. Think about the climate, the perceptions. I can guarantee you, if student need and literacy is being talked about at many meetings, then that's a value. So what you're talking about really reflects your values and beliefs and the climate around it, and the perceptions. What do people perceive about your school? What do people perceive about your classroom? Also project many times the value that's held around that. Now, we also look at how are students doing, and we know that by diagnostic tests, formative assessments, summative assessments, and then our processes say a lot about who we are too. How are we organized? What type of organization is in place in order for EL collaboration to take place in the building? How our students begin to look at, when in the planning stages for classes next year, do we look at EL students and special ed students first and organize around our special populations as we create the master schedule, or is it some type haphazard? What type of planning? All of these elements in this graph represent who we are, but also represents where we are in the process. So as you're thinking about your building, where are you? Of course, this is not a table, this is a Zoom talk. But as you think about those types of things, look at the causes. The value and beliefs around literacy in your building are what? And we know this by what? How do you know this? What has caused this and what are the effects of it? I'm just going to give you some quiet time to think about that, for example. In your building, the value and beliefs around literacy, and you can really think about, or you can change literacy to English learners, are what? Are this. And this is evidenced by this. Now think, what has caused that value? Now think the effects of that value. And so then we think about another question. Students are aware of their literacy skills, reading skills, their language skills, and are continually developing, or they do not know. And again, these are about our values, our students. And now we're beginning to go back to my initial slide and think about the why and the how. This is the why. This is the why. The why is student achievement, understanding where are our students and how do we know where they are. Sometimes older students do not know where they are in their reading ability. Our EL students sometimes do not know where they are in their reading ability. And that's powerful to a student to understand, hey, if I want to go to college, I have got to have a Lexile level, that's appropriate for college level. And my Lexile level at this point is here, and I need to increase that Lexile level in order to be here for my goals and dreams for the future. Having those conversations with students are very important. And that also impacts how. Once we know why, then our how is exponentially more powerful. Then we need to think about, where do we want to be? So when we looked at our values and we thought about our values and we said, you know what, literacy could be an improvement in this area. How do we emphasize it? Well, think about, dream. Where do we want to be with this? And then we have to think about, how are we going to get there? How are we going to get where we want to be? And so one of the things that you can look at is the adolescent literacy crisis and understand that many people graduating, and I'll let you do the research and all this because of time today, but you can Google real quickly and many things will come up about the crisis in regards to adolescent crisis and how that we need to redirect our concerns, especially around this need of students graduating from high school. And how do we as EL teachers and an EL faculty can address these things, because we have great strategies. and how we can be a tool to the high school. So once we become an asset to the high school, then we get on leadership meetings or teams, committees, and we begin to be a viable resource to help all teachers. Then people start to lean in to hear what you have to say. What we don't want is, oh, that's EL's issue, or that's, we give that to EL. That's a scheduling problem for EL. Let's call the EL teacher. What we want to hear is the value of this is our student, and we all need to be about the table and that collaboration. Remember the framework. How do we get our stakeholders at the table in order to address those issues for each student and bring everybody in a cohesive movement for all students? Now, one of the things that we want to look at is helping leadership understand when we see this picture, what do we think about? We see smiles, we see people engaging, and it looks like it's photoshopped. One principal said, I said, yeah, that's probably very true. However, we see engagement. But when we think about these types of things, as we see smiles and we see, and you can see that this is a bubble map here from a thinking map, that we begin to think about they're smiling, they're engaged, they're leaning in, as we think about all the characteristics of this picture and why is this happening? When we think about this, we still see engagement. It's just passive engagement. And a lot of our students many times are not engaged based on literacy, learning. And so as we begin to think about engagement, yes, students can be highly engaged, but what type of engagement? Is it compliance, which we're seeing now, or is it active? Are we seeing active engagement? And, an A, I would much rather a student get a B or C and really struggle with the content and want to discover more and have a passion for that subject than get an A in a class like this. So as we think about sometimes of the culture and how do we go against some of the things to help frame our values, we want to move from a remediation, isolation, memorization, solo work to how do we begin to, for high schools, acceleration. How do we begin to think about integration, application, and teamwork? How do we bring ELs in the classroom as essential assets of learning and part of that teamwork and the part of that application? How do we highlight multicultural literacy and multicultural learning and understand also too when students are needing that we don't think about remediation, but how do we accelerate in relationship to their needs? And when we think about literacy, and as we go in regard to Tim Shanahan has addressed in relationship to some of the work too, that as we see independent text, instructional text, and frustration text. Now, I am all about loving kids to success and achievement, not loving them to failure. So when we have loving to failure, we want to give them independent text all the time. We want to make sure that they're able to read. But when we give them frustrational text and we do the work as teachers to scaffold that work so that they are achieving academic language, they're looking at the functional approach of language, and as we also think about how that we move past, boundaries or borders for language development. Level 1 and 2, it's easy to get a lot of language growth. You hit level 3 and 4 and 5, and it begins to slow down. Sometimes we hit, but that's why we have got to push our students in relationship to do this. But when do we give frustrational text, and when do we give independent text, and how do we utilize all of these texts together? And so as we think about this, we, based on Shanahan's theory, what questions surface in regards to literacy and student engagement? And so the things that we have to understand, especially with English learners, is this language? And based on language, how well are they reading in their native language? And then as we think about their native language, Then we also go into, if now let's go back to their native language, can they read in their native language? If they're having processes of learning, if they're still in that grade 1, 2 kind of area of learning to read, then we have to go back to material that's appropriate for them to learn to read. But once they have learned to read, then it's important for us to really apply, the frustrational text. My philosophy is this: the teacher's job is to make sure that scaffolding is there for frustration text. When they go home to read, that's when they have independent text, so that they can absorb the material and the content. But when they're with that teacher, that teacher's job is to do that scaffolding for those students and the work for the students. So when we think about questions like this, and we think about our English learners or students that are having difficulty with literacy, this impacts their learning as well. So these questions come to mind. What outside assignments are given? And then what scaffolds are given for reading? What background knowledge is needed in order for this to happen? What kind of academic language needs to be explicitly taught? If we're giving independent reading, then what lexile levels are we doing that as? And then student strategies as well. And then also too, what reading are we giving in class? Are we pushing the borders and the boundaries in relationship to that so that they are gaining more context, more understanding about the text with that teacher's help, and then re-emphasizing that when they go to their homes with their independent reading. So one of the things that we talked about with the high school principals are some strategies. How do we get all teachers on board working with students so that we can help students that are struggling to read, in which these would be, very much beneficial to, English learners as well. And we talked, and we with research, we've looked at these primary reading strategies. If we could get teachers, for example, let's just say activating is the primary strategy we want to emphasize for the next 2 weeks. And then many of the content teachers would emphasize that activating or bringing up that prior knowledge and experiences of students and helping them use that as a strategy as well. And then maybe being on the same page with inferring, so that every class they go to, it begins to be reiterated that this is a strategy, and we're going to hone in on these reading strategies to help students navigate text, especially when it's difficult for them to do so. And so these that we talked about were activating, inferring, how do you clarify, questioning, searching, selecting, making sure that, are we looking for the right information? Are we selecting the right information? What's the question? Are we answering the question? Are we getting off task? Visualizing, how do we organize information? And so these were main strategies. And if we could all be on the same page with high school teachers, can you imagine if high school teachers, when they went to math, science, social studies, all of the different, and reading skills were emphasized by each one, how powerful that could be for students who need these strategies? But then the question is this: some of our teachers, or many of our high school teachers, possibly middle school teachers, don't know these strategies. So as an EL advocate, of course, an EL teacher advocate, tap into your EL teacher. They can help you with this. Faculty meetings, having a reading strategy per faculty meeting, and then go out and conquer that strategy. And just bring in, little by little, how do we bring in literacy as a focal point where it becomes a value in our secondary schools? And so this was the approach that, I worked in. And so I had the principals actually come up with an analogy for each of the reading strategies. So they had to come up with an analogy for activating, inferring. And so those analogies are very powerful. And I said, what would activating be like? And I think some of them said it would be like a Google search, you know, like, because as the, you know, you put into a word and then the Google search comes back and they activate. So they had to think about all of those and really work through those reading strategies. So you could think about how ways that you could possibly, you know, move into professional development and helping teachers with reading strategies. And I say this to say, was this entirely EL focused? No, but I knew I was not going to get very far if I concentrated 100% entirely on EL, because then they're going to look at, well, there's only a small percentage of EL in my building. You know how it works in relationship to that. I had to cast that net big enough in order so that EL was a huge part of that net. But I had to really, what are some great things that work for EL that if I could get teachers to do for EL, great. But then I wanted to frame it as helping students, you know, with their literacy. And that's what got principals' attention. So again, the how. How do you do this? Well, first of all, the why has got to be there. And the why is about student achievement, understanding where our students are, and do our students know where they are? And then how do we move there? And so one of the things that I really love Tim Shanahan's work in relationship to this, and he has a presentation on foundational reading skills in secondary education. I highly recommend that. But as we look at also to our framework, and this goes into the question about utilizing how do our lesson plans, how do content teachers' lesson plans utilize the ELD framework? How do we bring those standards in? And then in the 2020 framework, I love this, where, you know, what content are students expected to learn? What is the standard? And then as they look at that, and I told with the high school principals, I said, you know, every standard is just as much as it is content, is just as much language. How do we just drain that standard dry of the language that's needed for this class to happen? And so there's great tools in the 2020 framework, such as the key language uses. And so how are these students going to interact with this standard? How are they going to do this? Now, my approach with the principals was this. This is not a check thing. This is a get messy thing. Because once teachers understand that they can get messy with it and kind of play around with it, they're more apt to do it. The moment that they have to check, you know, this on the lesson plan, it gets scary. And what happens when people are scared? There's fear, and then it begins to be more about how than it is the why. And so we really want it to be more about the why into the how. And then as we move into this, what are language expectations that best reflect the language focus of the unit? And I think that this is so clear. So if we are going to argue a point and it's going to be given orally, then those are the ways functionally that we need to operate in relationship to the standard. What are things that they need? And then you can, you know, look at the subject area in the 2020 framework, and it will give you some ideas in relationship to this. And that's a good guide. Now notice the 2020 framework is a guide. You may have other ideas that may help with that standard as well. And then looking at the language functions and features, those little intricacies of the language that our students need. Sometimes people ask me, you know, or I hear, what's good for all kids, what's good for ELs is good for all kids. Well, that's 100% true, and that's 100% false at the same time. There are certain things that our EL students need in relationship to language difference, English to their native language, that they need specifically that native speaking kids do not need. And so we have to be cognizant of that fact. Where are students in relationship to their reading ability, their speaking ability, listening ability, writing ability, and how does that look in relationship to their native language? And then how do we address those needs? And yes, There are many strategies that we talked about with reading that would work for both, but sometimes we have to dig deep, and the 2020 framework really goes into how we can dig deep into language differences for our students and make that applicable, for that. Would I start there with high school teachers? No, I would not. That's down the road, because what we want to do is we want to be winsome to our teachers and making sure that they are part of the team, and then we gradually get them there in the process. But reading strategies would be a great. And then a part of that, sometimes teachers ask me, high school teachers or principals, was like, well, is there a way that you can kind of break this down that would make sense to our teachers? How is this so that we, when we look at it, how do we bring everything together? And so I thought, that's really good. And I developed this a while ago, and I change it all the time. I change it based on the needs of the person asking. What is their context and how to do this? Now, this is a general framework, and this may change based on keywords. This may change on initiatives, the word of the day, to get the idea across. But I said, if we could look at 4 pillars of instruction, what's the standards? And then when we think about that, the complex questioning that goes with the standard and the complex text that goes with the standard. And then what kind of academic discussion do we need to be looking at? What's the essential question? And Jeff Swears is really the part of this. Jeff Swears is a professor at Stanford. He's written Academic Conversations for English Learners. He's gotten many people know him. But I had a conversation with him not too long ago. And if students are leaning in, talking about the topic, that means they're engaged. And so many times our students go without engagement. I was in a classroom yesterday, and these students, I saw one student sneaking behind the teacher's, kind of getting away from the teacher, reading the text ahead. He's just trying to get in. He's trying to figure out what's happening on the next page. And I loved every minute of it. And I thought, oh my gosh, these kids are so engaged in this text. I can't believe it. The teacher had organized it in such a great way that it was interactive. She was bringing out language functions, but at the same time, they could not put that book down. And one kid just said, I just want to read the next chapter. And I thought, and this was from another student. And then as I left, I asked the teacher, I said, can I ask you a question? And I said, can I ask them a question? So I said, y'all really love this book? And they said, yes. And one kid says, it saved my life. And I said, how has it saved your life? He says, and he was struggling. And I think basically what he was trying to say is, it's not boring. But then we think about the social, emotional part of it and the cultural responsiveness, bringing in that multicultural diversity, literacy, and the fluency. As we think about that, we move into the content. So what are we going to teach in relationship to these standards? And what's the thinking behind it? The what? And then we move into the how, the academic language. And then how is this academic language going to be realized with reading, speaking, listening, and writing? And then we move into the task. What are we asking our students to do? And how does success look like? What does success look like when it's completed in relationship to this? And this is something that I've put together to help teachers kind of pull it together. I know one thing when you're working with high school, and I've been in a high school area, if it's chunked out too many parts and places, it's just like, sometimes people shut down. They don't have time for that. But if you can bring things together, consolidate things in a way that makes sense for high schools, it will go much further in relationship to getting buy-in. And that's the key, is getting buy-in. So I kind of talked through this, as you can see how this builds out. I got ahead of myself talking with my slides. So as we begin to hone in, the thrill, and again, the thrill is around the engagement of the task. So as we go back to these strategies and we think about these strategies and moving forward with activating, inferring, monitoring, questioning, the goal here then is, as I kind of consolidated all of those ideas for teachers and building in, how can you go back to your buildings and then think, you know what, how can I give out, instead of giving them 100 strategies, how can I boil it down to some strategies for a focus to send to the faculty? Hey, activating is this. This is a great reading strategy. I would love for everyone to use this strategy with English learners today and or with students that are struggling to read. Now, when you did that or with students are struggling to read, some teachers who may not have ELs this year may have them next year. Their eyes start going up. Oh, this is something I need to put into practice. This may help some other students. They may not have put that together. How can inferring help me? Monitoring and clarifying, questioning. How does searching and selecting for specific information, such as answering questions, defining words and terms? How do I visualize, organize the work in relationship to this? And then I also love the power of complex text. This is a video, and Dr. Clark, these videos are available. I mean, this PowerPoint is available for everyone, right?
Yes.
Okay, so they can have the references to this. I just knew if I went through all of these videos and different things that we would be here all day. And so this is a great video of a kindergarten class who was using a very complex text. And how you're thinking, now, wait a minute, I'm dealing with secondary teachers. And that's exactly what I did. I said, look, if kindergarten students can work with this level of thinking, what can your secondary teachers do? And what can your secondary students do in relationship to challenging their thinking? And I'm going to cut it off right there, Dr. Clark, for some questions, if there's any questions that they may have.
Dr. Stacy, we have yet again had another goosebumps moment in the presentation, as we did this morning. So I love what you're saying. We have some questions. So let me begin. And some of these questions were presented to us earlier in the day, but they relate to high school. So I'm pulling them from some earlier presentations. And so let me start. I loved the model that you just presented, where you made it a concise model to present to high school teachers on language teaching. And so there was a question that came to us in an earlier session. Is there training that they can purchase or bring to their district for someone to come and speak and train our ELA teachers?
So I've been in administration since 2010, and I've been asked to, I've covered the gamut. I was in Metro Nashville Public Schools, and now I'm in Clarksville, Montgomery. One of the things that I sometimes fear or sometimes or caution is that when people come in with barrels loaded, it sometimes overwhelms content teachers. And so I'm always about the winsome approach. And I think sometimes as we begin to think about helping ELA teachers, think about a language approach, I think a strong PLC is a good approach, because let's get everybody in and let's just hear what the experts say. What are some top people, and use and this is one thing too that helps. Whatever experts your district is using to really undergird their initiative. So like, for example, I love Tim Shanahan, but there's many. I mean, you open the gamut of literacy and there is, you're going to get a lot of different thoughts out there. So really hone in on what your district is really focusing on and the experts, and build around those experts. And then how does EL, and then tie it into EL practices, tie it into Brashen, tie it into Jeff Swears, tie it into Lily Wong Fillmore, tie it into some of the great, authors of EL, and how that they align. And I think that that's key, the alignment, so that people can see how does language and the content of ELA so meld with the ELD standards. And I think that that's key. But do I know? I mean, I usually develop my own stuff, professional development, really, and I bring in like this, this presentation today was something that I had to come up from scratch because I had to think about those high school principles. And I knew that I was going to be on stage, but I also knew that if the moment I came in and said, you got to do this, 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 get a lesson plan with all these ELD standards and have this done, and this is what the state wants, I would lose them in 2 seconds. And so that's the approach I would take. Do I know of a certain curriculum for ELA that brings this together? No, I've developed this approach for years and I tweak it continuously. I mean, if you were to ask me to go to your school, it would probably look a whole lot different because I'd be on the phone asking you, what is their literacy practices? Where, what curriculum are you using? And then I'd kind of shape it up like that. But I'm fine for people to use this, to tweak and do whatever you want.
Thank you for that. The premise of what we've tried to do in the ELL Collaborative is to find out how Tennessee teachers have applied directives and policies and instructions to their classrooms in Tennessee. And you're saying essentially the same. Let's find out what the experts say, let's find out what the research says, and then customize it to our school. Mm-hmm. And because that then brings it from the abstract or the far away to the real life every day here in my classroom in school. So I think that's absolutely a key concept for teachers. I think sometimes teachers may not have the confidence in their own abilities in pedagogy to tweak what's been given to them.
Yeah, tweak it.
But teachers, the insight of teachers in the classroom with students every day, that insight is powerful, and we can tweak what the experts say and apply it in our classroom. So
sometimes getting a good buddy, an ELA teacher working on tweaking and saying, would this scare you off?
Yes.
And if the answer is yes, go back to the drawing board. But if they say, you know what, I love it, this is great, I wish I had this, you're on to something.
Yes. All right, let's go. We had a couple of another set of earlier questions, one during the new teacher session and one during the state session that both addressed high school LEP students. So here are the questions, and I'll read both questions, and then you can address it. What was asked in the Tennessee Department of Ed presentation today was this: will the framework provide information on grading practices for students who are LEP? High school is one of those areas we continue to question. Okay, that was the question for the state. The other related question for the new teacher session was this: what do you do for high school students who are failing classes and it's because they're LEP? Do you advise high school teachers to modify the high schoolers' grades on report cards?
So that is a huge, deep well, and we're going to, we're going to take it step by step. Number one, official civil rights. Basically, at the end of the day, a teacher cannot fail a student based on language. Done deal. Okay. So I think, first of all, getting to your director, getting to your Title 3-point person, and having them highlight that with OCR and policy would allow, just having that knowledge. Now, we had a question last year. This came at the end of the year, and so this got elevated, to me. We had a student failing, and so the questions that I had was this, and this is true. Every year as a District 3 lead in a district, every student that fails, I have to put on a piece of paper and send it to the state. And by that name, I have to tell reasons why that student is failing. Okay? So now, can an EL student fail? Yes, they can fail if they just refuse to do the work, And there's no, I mean, the teacher has done, practically, almost moved into their house to scaffold and did all the work that they could possibly do. And the student just does not want to do the work, then they do not need to pass, but have that documentation. The teacher needs to know what, follow that ILP, an individualized learning plan to a T. They've got evidence of following that individualized learning T. They've got also how that they try to engage the student with different choices, how that we look at those types of things, then, then we've got to understand what is that, that student, is it a failure or is it not? Is it really due to language and the student cannot comprehend the content? Then we've got to look at, the next step. The next step is the type of scaffolding. And I am, I love thinking maps, and everybody, knows me, knows that I love thinking maps. Why? Because thinking maps focuses on the thinking of the content, breaks it down in visuals so that students can understand it. And so sometimes, the student's able to maybe not understand all of the context of language, but they can get the basic points of putting it on a visual and understanding in a way that represents the thinking behind the standard. That begins to help us understand that they understand the content and the standard and moving on. So, the key, though, is we can't have this black and white approach where this is the standard and I gave this assignment and they didn't do it and, and they fail. We've got to break this down into this is the standard, this is the assignment, and I am going to allow, if this is about, a defining or cause and effect, remember my PowerPoint before had cause and effect. What causes the value and what were the effects of the value in a simple diagram. And so as we think about that, that's what could be used for the student. So it's a very complex thing, but it's very interesting when I go back to teachers from central office and I say, I need all of your scaffolds and I need I need evidence of your scaffolds. I need evidence of your accommodations before I'm going to put this name down from the district office to the state, this child failed. It's amazing how things change real quickly.
Yes. Okay. We talk about content, we talk about language skills, and so in high school there's different kinds of assessment, but still, WIDA access, TCAP, EOCs. You have any particular advice or ways to think about or ways to best overlap your work to address those areas of assessment in high school?
One of the questions I get almost every other week is, when that test comes up, this student does not have the language to do this. Is it fair for him to take this test? I always say this, this is where it's about the student and having conversations with the student. If I were in the classroom in the high school, I would have an absolute conversation one-on-one with the child that's about to take the test and say, look, this is going to be so difficult. And I want to know where you are in language, and I want you to have practice with this test. Getting practice with this test is only going to help you in the future. And this is going to be a great baseline for us to go on. Don't worry about the test. This is just a reflection of, how much we need to work toward getting you to this level of passing this test in the future. We're going to get messy with it. And just get messy on this test. Try your best, but then know this is no reflection of your knowledge. This is no reflection. This is just a reflection of where we are in language. And we're going to try to, so that you can see what you need in order to improve on. I think it's a great motivation for students when they take the test, but having that conversation. Now you put a student without the conversation on that test, and then they feel like, oh my gosh, they take it personal, they get frustrated, it gets, but if a conversation, precedes the test, hey, I am your teacher and I'm not focused on this test, I'm focused on you. I'm more about you than I am about this test. But I think this test can help us understand how much work we have ahead of us in language. So you're going to take this test and you're going to feel miserable and you're going to be like, want to cry your eyes out and you're going to want to pull your hair out, but it is okay. Don't do it. And you're going to try your best. And then, you know what? We're going to have a Coke later and celebrate that we just took the test. And then I think that goes a long ways.
You know, to alleviate test anxiety for any student, but particularly English learners, is a gigantic step toward letting that test experience be a more accurate reflection. And you know, together with what you're telling them, this will show us the work we have to do. I also like to tell students, show me what you know. Show me what you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll see what you know, what you need help on, and we'll go from there. And so, yes.
Well, and sometimes you have students that get to that social language where they're just like rocking and rolling. You know, they, how you doing? And they can just roll that language out and confuse a lot of teachers thinking, well, they've got language. And then, but at that academic language, sometimes these tests is a reality checker. Say, whoa, do you really have this academic language? So sometimes it can work for the benefit in many ways. But I'm going to say this too. If you've got a student that has true high anxiety, and after the conversation, you know, go to the counseling office and whatever. It's, you know, we've got a great achievement officer in our district, and she says by no means put that child through that if they don't need to. It's not worth it. So if it's going to do damage, no, you know, unless the state, you know, there's sometimes we have to, you know, give a test because of the baseline, but I'm all about the student. So and that's very gray in some ways. And sometimes I just have to make the best decision I can for the student.
Right. And, you know, the other important person in this conversation is for parents to understand, you know, these are tests that we're taking, but to alleviate parent anxiety on it as well, if they just know a little bit more about how the outcomes are going to be used, so that, you know, so that the child may be hearing this chill from us at school, but parents, you know, saying, oh, you've got a test. And so I think to communicate that at home as well from the beginning of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I have a question that I'd like for you to elaborate on, because something you presented today was very exciting to me, and it's not new, but the way you presented it, and it's this: let us help high school teachers and administrators begin to view EL as a resource and not as a burden in the high school community, and to look at it as the source of really understanding how do we help all high school students do better with learning to read and learning language. That is very exciting to me. And here's my question. There are some key stakeholders in letting that become a norm in a school, a value of the school, and in transforming how a school community views that. And that would be the administrators, the gen ed teachers, the ESL teachers, and students. So my question to you is, how in a school that does not value the ESL role in learning, the broad role, how can we begin to transform the attitudes and the norms in that school community? Who would you start with? What would you say? What's a time frame? How would you transform that attitude?
Well, I think the first thing is, you know, administrators will always gravitate toward teachers who are empathetic toward them. All right. And so if you're, you know, if you've got to be flexible, understanding of your administration if you want them to be understanding and flexible with you. So we all have been to those faculty meetings where the teachers, I don't understand, da, da, da. Don't be that person. If there needs to be something, this is just flat out just basic, if new teacher orientation right now. If there's something that, if there's laundry that needs to be talked about, that needs to be done one-on-one with the administrator, not in a faculty meeting or whatever. So be in good favor with the faculty. But then I would say sign up for committees. When I was in the building, I signed up for the building leadership team. They put me on the building leadership team. Go to the administration and say, hey, on the building leadership team, I don't know, is there anybody representing, English learners? Could I be? Start volunteering. They'll be like, hey, they probably didn't even think about it. They'll probably say, absolutely. Could you be on the team? Yeah. For long, not only was I part of the team, I was the chair of the building leadership team. And so can you imagine the EL person, the chair of the building leadership team for high school? Now, did I get there just overnight? No, I didn't. I had to volunteer for the committee. And then from the committee, they saw, I was always raising my hand. How are we looking at diversity in our school? How are we bringing in EL families to the meetings? So being on those key committees in the school are viable. And don't feel that, well, I'm just an EL teacher. No, you are an EL teacher, and you have just a powerful voice. The second thing is to know what the experts say. Because when you're talking, reference what experts say. It will give you validity and power with what you say. When you're referencing powerful people, people begin to turn around and say, wow, they're well read. They understand. Don't just focus on EL. Think about the whole school. How will this impact all of the school in relationship to all teachers? When you get real focused on one area, and it's okay to be focused on one area, but if you're going to make a difference for the entire building, you have to think about all teachers and how does this look? How is it perceived? And then and then do some quick things. What's the value? How are we doing business? And then go bring that to the principal. I understand I don't hear a lot about diversity or multicultural literacy. I don't hear about this. And it makes me wonder where the value is on this. What do you think the value is? And then have that conversation. Well, I would love to help in this area. How could you help? Well, I was thinking about possibly doing this or doing that. And that begins to flourish. People then start seeing you as an expert in the building. And that's what you want. You want people to see you as an expert. I had a conversation with one of a lady in our district. She has 2 earned doctorates. And we had a conversation about how some people have doctorates and some people have doctorates. And I want that. Some people have doctorates and some people have doctorates. And we discussed that. People know when you know your content and people know when you don't. And the first thing I would say, volunteer, but know your content. And when people see you as a viable expert leader in the building, no matter if it's EL or what, they'll pay attention to you.
Excellent. That is excellent advice. Excellent advice. It's in the area of advocacy. So, a couple of questions have come from the viewers. So let's go back into some of what you discussed in the presentation. And this person says, is it right to give a D to a student because they cannot do the work, but they are trying?
Is it right to give a D to a student because they cannot do the work, but they're trying? I would go back to what has evidence to say they can't. That's what I would go back to. And is there another way to show they can? Is there another scaffolding tool that would say they can do it? Now, if they can't, if the language is there but the thinking, they're having a hard time with the thinking. Then if they deserve a D, then they deserve D in relationship to, but we've got to rule out language in the process. How do we make that explicit? What is that vocabulary? And how do we rule that that academic language vocabulary out? And how do we get it really about the thinking? And that's what we want to look at. Can this child actually do the thinking around the work? And so if they can do the thinking of the what of the standard, then they don't deserve a D, they deserve an A if they can do it, regardless of how, the standard has been accommodated. Now we have to be careful about modifying. Modifying and accommodating are two different things. Accommodation is about working with the standard and making sure that the student can represent the standard in multiple ways. That's accommodating. Modifying is when we take that standard and we lessen the standard in a way, and we got to be careful about that. IEPs deal with modifications. ILPs deal with accommodations. So as we think about this, we have to understand what is the what of the standard and how can that student show evidence of the what in any type of way that they possibly can. And so, and then what are their, and go back to this, what's the rubric? What is the criteria of grading that they're grading on? I have seen even native speakers rubric that were just horrible. When you're looking at, the content of trying to get messaging and theming and understanding more about the understanding of a writing piece, and then so much of the grade was on something that had nothing to do with the standard, on sentence structure or grammar. And so, what is the grading criteria? I think that that's also important to look at. What are we looking for and how is it evidenced? And then it should be about the thinking than the language.
Okay. And I want to reiterate a statement you just made that I think is helpful to remember, that IEPs are about modification and ILPs are about accommodation. Did I say that right?
Yeah, and as a general, summation, you can get detailed with them, an IEP can also deal with accommodations as well. But in general, in speaking, when we think about an IEP, we can more hone in on a modification. But ILPs, you'll notice there are no modifications. There's an accommodation checklist that we work with.
Okay. All right. So Dr. Stacy, hang in here with us because we keep getting questions. So here's another one. And actually, I'm going to skip to this one because it's related to this conversation we're having now. This person says, I have high school content teachers that say the EL students can't do the work, particularly the math teachers, because there is lack of foundational skills, not just the language. What can I do then?
So basically, we may have some interruptive education. They've missed some skills. They've come to an algebra class and they're missing some of the foundational skills that's needed. And so as we are moving into, sorry, someone tried to call me and through this, I think I got my phone off, but then I don't know, iPhones are too smart. And so as we look at this, it is the responsibility for every teacher, and of course I'm speaking to the choir, for all students to succeed and achieve in their classroom. So at the end of the day, how can we, bring them up to their skill set? So diagnostic test is going to help with this. So it'd be very interesting to say to the teacher, what skills do we need to focus on so that this child be successful? And if the appropriate diagnostic tests have been given, so that they can understand, well, this child is missing this, this, and this, then we may want to look at an intervention, RTI, in relationship to that child to hone in on those skills so that they can be successful in that classroom, or, some quick things in relationship to that. One of the things that we have, tried to help with this, and I had a conversation with an academic coach yesterday. A child came in and it's so sad. He's reading at a 6th grade reading level, but has no idea of numeracy. And when I say no idea, we're talking about kindergarten. And so we have adaptive software that does the diagnostic for us and then scaffolds for them through the process. And so that we have that right in line with the teacher so that they're getting a double dose from an adaptive software, also RTI, and then the teacher should be supplementing in relationship to helping them understand certain things. So, for example, if I'm teaching a formula in algebra, then I definitely want to make sure that if there's certain skills for this formula, I want to, possibly have a small group in that so that I can really hone in on that skill to provide them the foundation so that they can be more successful with the skill that's needed for that formula to be applied and implemented. And this is all gray. I'm telling you, this is hard stuff. I mean, when you're dealing with secondary students and coming in with different skill sets and teachers, and the first thing right off the bat, and that's why I say we got to be winsome to teachers, because you want them to work with you. You don't want them to be overwhelmed immediately and go, I don't know what to do with this child. I give up. I didn't go to school for ELL. And I've heard that before. I didn't go to school for this. So how do we, just say, okay, let's think about, can we do a small group and just hone in today's lesson, only today's lesson, what is the skill that's absolutely needed? And they may come back, they need all of them. And so at that point, we've got to segment, but we're not going to get any further, with the child by just cramming them with information that they can't understand. That's crashing, 1.1 is incomprehensible input. It needs to be comprehensible. So sometimes we have to take a step back to gain 2 steps forward.
And too, high school students are in that, again, another gray area, transitional time between child and adult. And, strategies that work in teaching children are a little bit different when we're teaching older people, and they tend to need to have a real world application as often as possible, and sometimes to move at a little faster pace. And I think what you're talking about with the RTI and the software and the teacher and, multiple ways, angles there, just to remember that they're almost adults in how they approach learning and thinking in the world. And whatever we can frame in terms of their real world experiences will help learning. And that means we have to know them. We have to get to know them.
This was so powerful yesterday talking to the academic coach. We did not have a secondary program that would go as low as this child. And so, but we did have elementary software, and she had a conversation with the student, from what I understand, or will have. But she said the student doesn't care what it is, they want to learn. And she says, this is going to be elementary. And she says, I don't want you to be insulted by the framing of this. And the student said, I don't care. I want to learn it. And that's what the student told the academic coach. And she says, okay, I just didn't want to insult you. But do you see how powerful that conversation went?
Yes.
And so many times we make the decision for the child without having a conversation with the child. No, I'm not going to insult that child with that program. And so they put them on a subpar program, and, that may meet some of the needs, but because we're so scared, but sometimes having a conversation that, well, I've got a program that's really childish. And the students, and I had that conversation because I guess my eyes went, and they says, oh no, the student said he didn't care, he wanted it. And I said, go for it. Get you the license tomorrow.
Yes. We still have another question here, and this one has to do with thinking maps. So the question is, yes, I thought you would like this question. So the question is, who is trained on thinking maps in your district? Is it the ESL teachers, or is it school-wide, or is it district-wide? Who's trained on thinking maps?
Well, when I came to Clarksville, this is about 4 years ago, nobody. But I'm a trainer. And so at this point, this past summer, we offered 20 binders. So you have to get a binder, and you get it from the company, and then they go through the training. We offered for 20 teachers for each high school to be trained in thinking maps. And we are looking with ESSER money to get thinking maps. And so we're going to do another training, hopefully. If you talk to your titled or federal people, they're all got gray hair and trying to pull it out with all this ESSER, trying to go back with approvals. But once everything's approved, we'll probably do another round of training with high school teachers, because we feel like that's a really great scaffolding tool for teachers, and that's why we implement it. I've also trained around 3 whole faculty elementary schools, and it goes by word of mouth. I'm gonna be honest with you, because teachers leave that training and they're like, well, I'll give you a testimonial. I came in to do a training at a faculty meeting at an elementary school, and the principal says, oh, one of our favorite people. And, central office doesn't get that very often. I'm just going to tell you that. When we walk into buildings, they're usually under desks. And so as I walked in, I said, oh, that's really nice. And they said, yeah, one of the teachers said the other day that this is one training they could finally use. I thought, oh, no. So teachers find it very useful, and they love it. They do really love it. So that's kind of where we are. But you have to be a trainer from the company, and I'm a trainer, and then I've been training. And then we've actually have gotten 2 other people in the district trained to be trainers just recently.
That's a high compliment when teachers tell you, I can actually use this. High compliment.
Well, I'll tell you another story too. This came from high school. Now, this was at central office, and this chair of science department comes in from one of the high schools and said, "Yeah, Stacy." I turned around and I thought, "What have I done now?" And so she says, "What have you done?" And I thought, "Oh no, I have said something in a meeting." The older you get, the less filter you have. And so I thought to myself, "What have I said?" She says, "No. There is this person in our building that everybody knows that does not change." Now, good teacher, solid teacher, but you have got to, let me tell you something. You better know it, and you better be able to convince him if he's ever going to change his practice. And I said, he came to me the other day and said, these thinking maps, we need to plan with them, and we got to be implementing them. And she said, Kevin, and then I went to the district content lead of that department, and I said, there was a teacher, and I didn't even have to say the teacher's name. She already knew it, and said, you are a god if you can convince this person to change his practice in regards to thinking maps. And I was like, it wasn't me, it's just the content. So it works. It really does.
That's a great story. Again, to give teachers what they can take back and use is so key.
Win-win.
We continue to try to do this in the ELL Collaborative. It's been one of our premises since the beginning that I always said, I hope after teachers have attended one of our sessions, they can go back tomorrow and use it. And so, Dr. Stacy, that's all the questions that have come through right now. And I believe your session today, I believe there are some teachers who will take this back tomorrow and use it. And I cannot thank you enough.
My last words is, I know the state, and of course they have to do their jobs, and your leaders have to do their jobs. But I think I've learned this from my grandmother. You can win more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. And so I really, it's not about today. It's about building practices, the why and the how for tomorrow. And if you can win them today, you build on that for tomorrow. But if you don't win them today, you have no tomorrow. And so bring them today with small practices, and then win them over, build on that, and get messy with it. it's not about a check. It's about, reflecting. It's about reflecting. That didn't work so well. Okay, you got messy with it. Try again. Try a different strategy. Try a different way. And have fun with it. Sometimes in education, we've gotten to this, observation check and compliance and walkthroughs and, break out of that and just get messy with education. Have fun with these kids, and some of the questions I was thinking about before about organizing and planning, how can you get all of this done in one thing? When you're dealing with students, how, paperwork wise, how can you file something about that paper, write it up really quick and do this so that you can have a life. But if you are more concentrated on emails and trying to answer it than you are instruction, change that. Get focused about kids. You'll go home energized and you'll want to come back. But if you get energized, but if you're struggling with paperwork, change it. Get energized about kids.
Our typical PD sessions we don't usually hear about being winsome or getting messy. We don't usually hear much about honey and vinegar, but the way you frame this is very meaningful, it's very funny, and it's very spot on. So again, Dr. Kevin Stacy, Clarksville, Montgomery County Schools, I cannot thank you enough. We hope to see your face again on one of our future sessions where we may have a little more time perhaps in the Summer Academy to expand on some of this. But thank you for your time, your expertise, and your messy energy. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So we are wrapping up the 2021 ELL Fall Collaborative. Let me remind you that we have the Discord discussion platform on our website, and you will see the website right now on our screen. And we've asked Dr. Stacy and the other presenters to monitor this Discord site for any questions you might post in this week following their presentation. If you have other questions for Dr. Stacy, put it up on the Discord site. On our homepage, it says continue the conversation. The Discord site is also a place that we will keep up there continually to actually continue the conversation between sessions, because we want to build support networks between and among ELL teachers in Tennessee. So with that, I'm Dr. Laura Clark, Director of the Center for Educational Media at MTSU's College of Education. Thank you for joining us today for the ELL Fall Collaborative at MTSU.